Okay, here we go. We are on our final grade of prayer here. Okay, so we've ascended all the way from vocal prayer, okay, reciting written prayers like the Our Father, or just having a conversation with God about how your day is going, what you need, whatever it is, all the way through the prayer of conforming union, which is described as the state of spiritual betrothal. Okay, you're engaged to be married with God in some sense, obviously in a spiritual way. And now we have reached grade 9, the prayer of transforming union. Okay. Prayer of transforming union is the transformation of the soul into God by participation. That's an important distinction, by participation. All right, so this is the highest degree of union with God that we can achieve in this life. The beatific vision is going to be reserved. That's basically what heaven is, where we finally see God clearly as he is in and of himself, okay? And it's just pure bliss at that point. This is the closest we can come in this life. Okay, so obviously we're talking about a pretty supernatural reality here. Hard to get a full grasp on it. But we can say, look, the soul remains distinct from God, so this is not a sort of pantheism like in Hinduism, where the soul becomes absorbed in God, ceases to be distinct from him, sort of becomes absorbed into this soul soup. And so your consciousness becomes the consciousness of God. You cease to exist as an individual. Okay, that's not what we're talking about. So the soul remains a separate or distinct being from God's being. Okay, but John of the Cross is going to describe this for us in a lot of different ways. He says the soul appears to be God and to have all that God has. Okay, so an analogy here, he mentions this window analogy. So imagine you have a perfectly transparent window. Windex, absolutely clear, the kind of window that a bird flies into because it doesn't even realize it's there. Okay, so the light of the sun shines through the window. The window is distinct from the light itself, okay, but the light is in the window, right? It passes through it. It illuminates the window, it makes the window visible in some sense, okay, and it warms the window with its own energy. So if you walk up, you touch the window, it has the light or the warmth of the sun. Okay, not in its full intensity, but it has been warmed by the sun. Okay, but all you see when you look at the window is the light that is coming through it. So the window is not the light, but to all appearances, the window is the light. Okay, and the window itself is transformed by the light passing through it. Okay, so that's the analogy here. The soul is the window, and the light is the glory, the love, the being of God Himself. Okay. So the glory of God is shining through the window that is the soul, which has now been perfectly cleaned, almost perfectly cleaned. Okay. So the glory of God is in the window that is the soul. It illuminates the soul. It warms the soul with its own energy. Okay. And so all that one sees when looking at that soul is the divine light, the divine glory. All right. That's the transformation that we're talking about here. So John of the Cross uses these kinds of terms. The soul is transformed into God by love. It is God of God by participation. He says the soul is more divine than human. Okay. All of those describing this kind of reality that he's talking about. Okay, so a longer quote from him. The soul becomes brilliant and transformed in God, and God communicates to the soul his supernatural being to such an extent that the soul appears to be God and to have all that God has. The soul seems to be more God than soul, and is truly God by participation, just like the window is light by participating in the light. Although it is true that the soul's being, so distinct by nature, is possessed by the soul as something distinct from the being of God, which is what I said earlier, as it was formerly, even though transformed, just as the window is distinct from the ray of light which illumines it. Okay, so there you go. Now, another analogy here is marriage. So let's get at that one. John also says there is as great a difference between the state of conforming union and the state of transforming union as there is between betrothal and marriage. For in betrothal, when you're engaged, There's only a consent by agreement and a unity of will between the two parties. In other words, the bride and the groom have mutually agreed to get married, and they become united in will. They will or desire or choose the same thing. And the jewels and the adornment of the bride to be given her graciously by the bridegroom. Okay, that's starting to enjoy the fruits of marriage. Okay, but in marriage, there is likewise communication between the persons and union. So there's the difference. We've got in betrothal, or conforming union, you've got the mutual consent, the unity of will. Okay, they want the same thing, and they've chosen the same thing. And you've got some gifts that have already been given to the bride. But marriage is the communication, in other words, the exchange of persons, then, and the union that is the perfection of that marriage. Okay. All right. So spiritual marriage. Involves three elements here. Number one is the transformation of the soul in God, as we described above. The union of the soul with God transforms the soul. You've also got mutual surrender. Okay, so just as marriage consists in this total gift of self between the two spouses, the husband and the wife totally give themselves to one another, surrender themselves to the other. This grade of prayer involves a total surrender of self to God and of God to yourself. Okay, so the soul and God mutually surrender to one another. And then you've got a permanent union of love. This is a permanent state. In other words, the soul is so perfectly united with God that because of the grace that God gives the soul, it's practically impossible for the soul to commit a mortal sin, which would then break that relationship of mutual love and result potentially in the loss of salvation. Okay, so mortal sin is practically impossible because of how filled with God's glory and love and grace the soul is. All right, so that's the highest grade of prayer. All right. As a little epilogue here, a little side note, why does morality matter? We've talked about morality in terms of the natural law. Okay, it's based on what's objectively good and fulfilling for us. Okay, so this law is a work of wisdom. It's given us to guide us toward the fulfillment of our human nature. Okay, we've talked about that. Remember the river analogy. The moral law provides the banks of the river that channel the water towards our fulfillment. Okay. We can also look at morality in relational terms, though. Excuse me. Okay. Because our human nature is designed by God for union with Him, okay, the moral law also expresses what it means to be faithful to God. Okay. In other words, then sin violates our fidelity to God. It violates and disrupts our relationship to God. Okay. So because of that, because it disrupts that relationship, it actually prevents us from enjoying this spiritual marriage with Him, this perfect union with Him. So sin and union with God are completely incompatible because of what sin does to our relationship with Him. Okay, so that's why the prophets of the Old Testament describe Israel as an adulterer or an adulteress. Okay, by violating the terms of the covenant between God and Israel, Israel was being unfaithful to God in a way that's analogous to marital infidelity. Okay, so it's analogous to adultery. All right. So if we look at morality in those relational terms, then we can see it how it fits into this sort of grade of prayer, these grades of prayer. Okay, sin will prevent us from enjoying, ultimately reaching this spiritual marriage with God. Okay. All right. It's really important that morality is not just a set of rules, right? It has relational effects and it has effects based on our own human nature. All right, next week we may talk about the dark night of the spirit and the dark night of sense as a couple of things to wrap up our spiritual conferences. Until then, have a good weekend.